Hey guys, this is Anon, and I am going to do an overview of the newest tank tree coming to Blitz in Update 3.6. It is our first French tank line. It's going to be the line that leads to the AMX 50B at Tier 10. It's a line of mostly heavy tanks. We do have some medium tanks mixed in, and it's a really interesting line that kind of mixes the profiles of medium tanks, heavy tanks. We've got a lot of autoloaders, we've got some mobility, we've got some slow tanks, so there's a lot of variety, but at the same time it's a pretty consistent line that's pretty linear. So we'll go through each tank individually and try and give you a little update on what you can expect from each one. Starting off at Tier 1, we have the Renault FT, which is actually really similar to the Japanese Tier 1, the Renault Otsu. They look very similar and have similar profiles in armor. The FT has slightly less armor. It's 16 all around on the hull, 22 in the turret, but still making it very strong. What is a little bit more unique about this tank is its autoloader. It's a 6-shell autoloader that reloads each shell at 1 second with a clip reload at 7.8 seconds or so once it's maxed out. Each shell doing 25 damage, but at Tier 1, if you high roll a few of those shells, you can actually kill another Tier 1 in one clip, making it pretty dangerous. The gun also has extremely high penetration values at 46 on AP and 68 on APCR, which means it can go through absolutely anything at Tier 1 with these, anything at Tier 2 with these, and honestly, if it saw Tier 3, it would do just fine as well. So, all in all, I think this is actually going to be the best at Tier 1. I don't usually find myself talking about Tier 1 a lot, but if you want a club with some relaxation, I think this tank is going to be pretty fantastic at it. Moving on to Tier 2, we have the D1, which is classified as a light tank. Although it has much more characteristics of a heavy or medium, it's extremely slow, but actually has some of the best armor in Tier 2, only behind the T-18 American Tank Destroyer, which means it's going to be able to bounce a lot of shells. It also starts to pick up some gun depression, which is pretty fantastic and one of the main characteristics of this entire line. Another trend we tend to see in this line are shared guns as you move up tier to tier, and this tank is very similar. It has the same gun as the Renault FT at Tier 1, but it actually has less DPM on the same gun. Same good penetration values and good gun handling, so it'll do really well, but it actually has some of the lowest DPM for Tier 2, so you'll have to use that armor and gun depression to make up for it, but I think it's something that this tank will be able to handle really well, and it'll be probably a favorite Tier 2 clubbing tank. At Tier 3, we have the D2, which even though it shares a similar name to the Tier 2, it's actually quite a bit different tank. It's extremely slow, not very mobile at all, but again, it packs some of the best armor for its tier. Only place where it lacks a little bit is the turret at 46 all the way around. Still fantastic, but it makes it second in class behind the PZS-35. The hull is fantastic at 40 all the way around, so when you are top tier, it is going to bounce a lot of shells and be extremely dangerous. The gun switches to a fast-firing single shell gun that fires about 21 rounds a minute. Continues the trend of also really high penetration values at 66 for AP and 98 for APCR, which is really fantastic and won't have trouble getting through any tanks for the tier at all. Also has really nice gun handling with .367 dispersion, which is pretty much best in class at these tiers. So between the bouncing and a really good firing gun, I think this is another tank that's going to be really nice for the low tiers, and it really has a trend of having nice low tier tanks in this tree and kind of going up and down as we kind of move along the list. At Tier 4 we see the start of our heavy tanks, which is where we'll stay for the rest of the line with the B1. I know these are very exciting names. But this tank should look familiar. It is extremely similar to the PZB2, the fairly famous premium tank for Tier 4. It has the same fantastic armor as the PZB2 with 60 in the front, 60 on the sides, 55 in back, and also on the turret with 46 all the way around, which is extremely good at tier 4 and tier 3. You're going to bounce a lot of shots, you can side scrape, it's fairly mobile, it moves around really well. It actually has 500 more hit points than the B2, and I think that's partially because it doesn't have preferential matchmaking being a normal tech tree tank, which means it's going to see tier 5 a lot more frequently. Has the same gun as the D2 as the tier before it, but again, kind of with this odd trend, it actually has less DPM, but a little better gun handling than the lesser version. All in all, I think this tank is going to be a little bit underpowered at tier 4. When you're top tier or even tier, it's going to be extremely strong like we're used to on the PZB2, but the premium version always struggled when it accidentally was brought into tier 5 games, and this isn't going to be much different. The extra hit points probably won't make up for the fact that the gun is fast firing but doesn't have fantastic DPM once you get into that tier, and I think the armor won't make nearly as much difference too. Still a pretty good tank, but the premium version with its preferential matchmaking is going to continue to be the favorite. Tier 5 brings in a rather funky looking tank with the BDR G1B. I swear I'm not making these names up. That kind of resembles a toy tank. It doesn't look like something that would exist in real life, but is what we see here is definitely a heavy tank. On the low end as far as armor is concerned, hull is 60-40-60 and the turret is 80-70-60. That actually makes it really similar to the VK 30.01H, the German heavy tank, which is pretty known for its lackluster armor. A top speed of 30 kilometers per hour isn't particularly fast, but it has fairly good traverses, so it moves around the battlefield a lot better than a lot of heavies, kind of similar to maybe a T1 or M6 American heavy, something along those lines. The gun is a little bit unique in that it hits really hard. For tier 5 it has 225 alpha, which is really pretty fantastic. It's a little bit higher than most of the tanks at the tier, firing at about 8 rounds a minute. That gives it an extremely competitive 1782 DPM, putting it right near the top as far as tier 5 heavies are concerned. Overall, I feel like this tank is pretty average. It's not necessarily going to stand out from other tier 5 heavies, and isn't going to be that remarkable because of its slightly lackluster armor. I think it's more of a quirky tank, and it just kind of falls in line with the rest of the tanks for the tier. Tier 6 starts to get really good with the ARL 44. This has a really kind of unique combination of skill sets that I think makes this tank a lot of fun and could be really interesting. The whole armor is really, really good at 120 in the front. The side's not so good with 50 and 50, but the sloping on the front also makes it extremely dangerous. It's going to be pretty difficult to pen for most tier 6 tanks, pretty much anything at 5, and will struggle with tier 7 a little bit as well. The turret armor's not quite as impressive at 120 in the front and horrible on the sides with 30. You'll have to be careful because you can HE the side of the turret pretty easily, but the front is just strong enough to bounce a little bit with troll. I think the hull is going to be what's the strongest about it, but it has really, really strong gun depression, which means you can minimize the size of that turret and peek up over hills, so that I think it's going to be pretty dangerous to kill, especially because it moves really well. We're starting to get more into that kind of heavy range with a top speed of 37 kilometers an hour and good traverses at 35 on the hull and 27 on the turret once it's maxed out. So it moves around really well and has some good characteristics on those lines. The gun is particularly special on the ARL. It actually has a tier 8 90mm gun with best-in-class DPM for a tier 6 heavy. It also has extremely high penetration values. The AP is at 212 with the APCR at 259. That standard AP is a higher pen than most tier 6's premium ammo, so you're going straight through anything. The gun also handles pretty well with a .337 dispersion, a little bit high aim time on 5.2, but still a really, really nice gun. So I think this is one of the better tanks in the line and one that's going to be a lot of fun to drive. Tier 7 is a bit of an outlier for me. We have the AMX M4 MLE 45. It's classified as a heavy, and it does have that heavy feel because it moves around really pretty well, more like a medium, but not a very fast medium with a top speed of 35 kilometers, although with good traverses. But it loses all the hull armor that the ARL 44 has. It's only 90 in the front, 40 on the sides. The turret, 100 in the front, 70 on the sides, 40 in the back. So as a heavy, that's essentially paper armor. You're really not going to bounce much of anything at all unless you just get lucky. It does keep pretty much the same gun as the ARL, which was fantastic at Tier 7, but it's not quite as impressive at Tier 8. It picks up a little bit of DPM, pushing it to 2400, which is really fantastic. But this is a tank that feels like it's all about the gun, and while it's good, it's not quite as impressive tier for tier as that ARL 44. So this tank's a little bit odd to me. I don't think it's going to be super competitive. It seems a little bit like an egg in the line to me because it just doesn't do anything particularly well except do a little bit of damage. But its size and lack of full medium mobility, I think, will hold it back a bit. It does have really nice gun depression, as does most tanks in this line, but I'm not sure if it's going to quite make up for its other shortcomings. We'll just have to kind of see how that plays out. Tier 8 brings the AMX 5100, and the Tier 8, 9, and 10 tanks all are going to share a really similar profile in that they're very lightly armored, heavy tanks, pretty much paper armor with autoloaders, very strong burst damage, really good mobility, so it's really going to bring a different kind of play style with that. When I say paper armor, I completely mean it. 90 in the front, 35 on the sides and rear of the hull. The turret is 90 in front, 30 on the sides, basically making it an HE magnet. Be very careful on the sides or back because that will be the first thing that comes for it. This tank does move around pretty much like a medium though. 45 kilometer top speed, 45 traverse on the hull, and 40 on the turret means it moves around extremely quickly. So it really has more of a medium feel to it, just with no armor as you move around. Still fantastic gun depression, just like this line shows you, so you can work ridges and keep the profile on this tank pretty small, especially because it has a small turret. So I think you can keep that cross section and keep it pretty protected most times. You do make up for the armor a little bit by having best in class or tied for best in class hit points, so there's a pretty large pool to work from with 1600. The high tier tanks in this line are really all about the autoloaders, and this is no different. It's going to be a little bit unique for Blitz, not quite one we've seen before. So it's a 4-shell autoloader. The whole magazine reloads at 22.5 seconds, which is extremely slow, and means you're going to have to be careful with positioning because you really need to be able to hide while that's happening. You've got 3.33 seconds in between shells, but the fact that it's 4 shells with 280 average damage means you can dump out 1120 damage in 10 seconds, which is absolutely fantastic. That you can take 2/3 of the health for pretty much any other tier 8 heavy tank in that time frame, so the burst is really notable. And why it's a little bit different from the other autoloaders we've seen, especially with the heavies with 3 shells, this can really unload a lot of damage and be extremely dangerous in that way. It also has really good gun handling, fantastic pen at 220 and 250. Which lets it get through just about anything, especially with that standard AP. You can see what it did to an IS-3. I think this can be a little bit of an IS spam equalizer because it won't have any trouble with the penetration values. You just have to shoot and relocate and make sure you don't take any shots in between. Tier 9 brings the AMX 5120, which is kind of the natural evolution from the AMX 5100 at Tier 8. Similar profile in that we completely lack armor. The front of the hull is 100, but 80 on the sides, which is actually pretty good, and along the class you might be able to side scrape with it just a little bit. Turret armor is pretty non-existent, 100 in the front, 80 in the sides, and 60 in the back, although not quite making it an HE magnet except against high tier tank destroyers. It has medium style mobility at 50 kilometers an hour with 40 hull traverse and 40 turret traverse, with a lot of horsepower at 1100. So this tank will really move around the battlefield. Definitely has that heavium classification, and with good gun depression, again, you can keep that profile a little bit smaller, making it hard to hit. The main difference, I think, in the armor and everything loadout from the 5100 is the 120 is much larger, much bigger profile to shoot, and so you have to be a little bit more careful about hiding it, moving it around. It also has fantastic reverse speeds. I was easily doing 20 kilometers plus in reverse, which means you can back out of bad situations a lot easier. The gun switches to a much more tier 10 profile with only a 3-shell magazine, extremely long magazine reload time of 24.3 seconds, so again, you'll have to be very careful with positioning and making sure you have a place to back out for that reload. But the shells unload at 2.5 seconds, so you can unload 1200 damage in 5 seconds, which is really good burst, and that's where it actually starts to be an advantage a little bit. Also, pretty good gun handling at .337 dispersion and at 3.7 aim time, which is also really fantastic. The main thing with these tanks is going to be that clip reload, and something you have to be extremely careful about in kind of late game situations. At the top of the mountain, we have the AMX 50B, which actually is really pretty similar in a natural progression from its Tier 9 version. The armor is a bit of a trade-off. It actually gains 70 millimeters in the front from the 50-120, giving it 170 on the front, but sacrificing on the sides at 30 and 30 on the hull. The turret also picks up a little bit of armor, making it 150 on the front, but losing on the sides at 50 and 30. So the frontal hull armor is extremely good and very bouncy, but the sides are extremely HE friendly. Even a medium will be able to pen the sides with HE. And the turret, even at 150, is pretty much paper. Absolutely anything can go through it, mediums, heavies, TDs. It's really a non-issue. Where you have to pick up your protection is from the fantastic gun depression that it has. We don't have the numbers on the test server for gun depression, but I can tell you it is gotta be best in class, better than any other tier 10 is. Absolutely fantastic, and that will help keep that profile down a little bit and help keep your tank better hidden because it is a really large profile. Also extremely mobile. It gains some power to weight ratio with a 1320 horsepower engine, which is fantastic. But the mobility is slightly less in the traverses than the 5120, with about 31 on the hull and 38 on the turret, which means it won't quite turn as much, but it has great straight line speed with that 50 kilometers speed limit. The gun is slightly improved from the Tier 9 version, picking up another 0.4 rounds a minute, but that actually still gives it the worst DPM at Tier 10 of any tank at 2620, making it also worse than the mouse. It gains some gun handling though with a 0.31 dispersion, which is fantastic, puts it in the top of the class, but loses a little bit of aim time to 3.9. Still very good gun handling overall. This tank still shows great burst damage, but I'm a little worried at the DPM at Tier 10 because it's so much worse that it might struggle a little bit like we've run into with the T57 Heavy. The fact that it gets its shells off much faster is certainly a benefit and will keep you from being exposed quite as long, but just something we're going to have to keep in mind kind of with that gameplay. Overall, this is a really interesting line. After going through this overview, I'm a little bit higher on it than I was originally. I think there are some pretty unique tanks in here that could be a lot of fun. Nothing is overpowered for sure, except for maybe that 5100. That tank could be really fantastic, but there really are a few gems in here that I think kind of fit in with the meta of what's happening right now. We'll see how the top 2 tier tanks play out, but I'm not really sure on that yet. So hopefully this helps and at least gives you a little bit more information as this line's coming out. You can decide if you want to grind it or not. And yeah, take care, guys.